Excellent. Right. Okay. Let me just go down the line. I suspect most of you will know who all of our panelists are. But first we have Natalie Jaresko, Executive Director, Financial Oversight and Management Board in the rather exotic location of Puerto Rico. Whoa. You know what? When you've been trying to fix the Ukrainian economy for a few years, you definitely need a break. And Puerto Rico sounds like quite a good place to take a break. Next to Natalie, we've got chairman of the YES board, a former president of Poland, of course. You all know him, Aleksander Kwaśniewski. Aleksander, welcome to you. Now, next to Aleksander, please welcome Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze. Now, I've known Ivanna for a few years because she first got me involved, of course, along with Victor, in coming to YES. So it's a real pleasure for me now to have Ivanna on a panel. And of course, she now is Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine for European and Euro-Atlantic integration. Next up, we have Sergii, it's Aleksander, right? Aleksander Danylyuk, who is Minister of Finance of Ukraine, familiar to many of you. Please give him a very warm hand. And at the end, we have Sergii Leshchenko, who is MP and, of course, activist campaigner of long standing in this country. Welcome to you. Now, we just saw a very short summation of what is a fascinating survey, suggests that the direction of travel of European opinion when it comes to Ukraine, Ukraine's ambitions, particularly with regard to the EU, the direction of travel isn't positive. On the EU in particular, we can talk about the differential between the EU and NATO, but overall, Natalie, let's start with you as you're closest to me. What's your response to what we learned from the outline of that survey?
I don't think we can draw direct conclusions that the feelings of those that were polled directly relate to Ukraine. I think there's an enormous element in there of the exhaustion in the EU from expansion. So I think there are lessons to be learned for Ukraine. There are targets there for diplomacy and for active work in terms of, for example, France that was pointed out. But I don't believe that we should jump to the conclusion that this means that the feelings towards Ukraine have grown significantly worse. I think it's part of it. I think there is a level of maybe tiredness in Europe with regard to the Ukrainian story. So again, from a diplomatic perspective, we need to continue to raise the story in a way that will make us proud, and we need to continue to perform the reforms that are ahead of us in a way that makes us proud. But I don't believe we should draw a direct conclusion from those results solely to what Europeans think about Ukraine.
Aleksander, you obviously former president of a country that seems favorable, maybe not entirely surprising, but seems very favorable both to EU membership and NATO membership for Ukraine. But give me your overall perspective, because obviously, according to the survey, polls are somewhat out of sync with the feeling in much of the rest of Europe on these issues.
Well, first of all, I would like to say that Natalie is right. This change of acceptance for Ukraine is very much connected with this mood of European Union in Europe. But concerning Poland, I have to say, well, I think that is something what I appreciate very much, that Poles are so positive, so in favor of Ukrainians. And we have some serious experience. We have 1 million Ukrainians, more or less, working in Poland, and it creates no problems, it creates no tensions. We have a common border, we have a lot of business, also small business. So I think it's a lot of positive evidence that Ukrainians are good partners, and therefore they should be also part of this Europe, which is now our structure, our organization. If I may, I want to say one negative element, and that is my message to Ukrainian politicians, also to Polish politicians. We have now in Europe the wave of nationalism, and this wave of nationalism is quite visible. And I'm very much afraid that because of very complicated, dramatic history in the past between Poland and Ukraine, and with because of lack of real debate, real exchange of opinion on all levels, among academics, among intellectuals, in artistic form, etc., and especially among the people, we can have such situation and the governments are not enough sensitive in this issue. So we can have in quite short time situation that the mainstream of Polish-Ukrainian relationships can be absolutely created by nationalist wings of the parties or nationalists. That is a real danger. And I think that is something what is easy to stop. It needs only the more active reactions from the side of the governments, more debates, more discussions, and you have a good model for that, because I don't know how many years together with Leonid Kuchma we signed such document about Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation, and it was okay, it worked quite effectively. But today, last 2 years, I see the real danger that we can resign as such positive European mainstream of public opinion. We can resign or give up and give this space for nationalists from both sides. That is extremely dangerous.
Okay, thanks, Aleksander. Madam Vice Prime Minister Ivanna, do you look at the example of Turkey and worry? I mean, it became obvious some time ago, I think, that opinion across the existing member states of the European Union had turned pretty comprehensively against the idea of Turkish membership. The Turkish government clearly picked up on that, and the Turkish people did. And now, on both sides of that particular issue, both in the European Union and in Turkey, there is a great deal of sort of sour feeling. Could that happen here in Ukraine?
Thank you, Stephen. First and foremost, what we did not see from this movie is the actual level of general support for Ukraine joining the EU and joining NATO. And the numbers on the overall are 48% of European citizens supporting the EU membership of Ukraine, and 58% of the citizens of the EU are supporting membership of Ukraine in NATO. My take from these results is that maybe the bureaucracy of the EU and maybe the leaders of the EU countries are not really following the advice of their people. Because we heard yesterday from Farid Zakaria, he said when someone in the West is winning elections with 45%, that's already seen as a hero. So basically Ukrainians are on the winning curve. In Europe, I think 48 and 58%. And therefore that means that we would have to concentrate more, as Natalia was saying, both on our homework to deliver and let people know more about ourselves and explain what we are and who we are in a more explicit way, but at the same time also build on the strength, because 58% of people supporting our joining NATO means that European citizens do have both tactical understanding of what of the imminent Russian threat for their own countries, and have some strategic understanding of enhancing security if Ukraine joins towards their own nations. So therefore, they are seeing both values and interests, and that's what we have to shoot for. Also, in understanding with the EU that there are also values and interests of both the EU and Ukraine in leaning and towards each other and integrating with each other.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Minister Danylyuk, I wonder whether you feel that somehow you're not getting the rewards that you deserve. You know, we heard Prime Minister Groysman today listing the different areas of reform commitment, saying delivery is happening, it's not just words, it's deeds as well. I know that in your department, your ministry, you are intent upon reform. Do you feel that the EU member states, both at government level and public opinion level, aren't aware of what's happening here, or your message is not getting across, or whatever? I mean, I take Ivanna's point that even on the EU issue, apparently 48% believe long-term membership is the right thing, but that means 52% absolutely don't. So what's happening?
Thank you. Very good question. Well, I have my principle in life. I don't believe that somebody owes something. I believe that...
Minister, keep the mic as close.
Yeah, sure. In terms of our reward, I, yesterday in the evening, returned from Food Days roadshow, where the first time, our first roadshow since 2010, when now we're returning to the capital markets. And we spoke with a lot of investors. And what I can tell, that story is clearly understood. They understand that Ukraine, for the last 3 years, changed so dramatically that now it deserves to be present on the markets. And this is because of reforms that we've done over the last 3 years. That's a clear indication. That's at least the reward for me as a Minister of Finance, trust of investors. When I look at the report, I can only, I actually, if you don't mind, share my thoughts on it. What I see is confusion. Europeans are confused. There are some phobias clearly developed that doesn't help them to shape one single position. And they themselves less optimistic about future. I lived in the UK myself with the family when anti-European kind of sentiment was growing. And it wasn't properly addressed. As a result, Brexit happened. So, that's what's happening now needs to be addressed. If you look at Ukraine vice versa. Ukraine, now 75% of Ukrainians support European integration. And I can tell you that most of it is, many Ukrainians haven't been to Europe. They idealize Europe. It's a myth in a way, right? And we believe, that Europe is only about quality of life, but it's also about responsibilities. There are also some problems there. And maybe it's good that at this moment we don't talk about this in Ukraine, because it helps us to support our story, our reform agenda. If you look at Russia, they actually would play some negative results, but we somehow don't communicate this internally. I understand why. We just prefer not to look at this. We believe in Ukraine, at least the politicians, we believe in future of EU. We believe that EU will be different in 5 years, it will be different in 10 years, and that's the EU that we want to join. And yes, we Ukrainians build our story on European values. This is much more important. And we hope to join EU when EU also will be different. And I also believe that at that time, UK itself would like to return to the Union.
Yeah, that's entirely possible, but let's not go there, because we could get very easily diverted into a discussion of what might happen to the UK, and that's not what we're about. So Sergii, just seems to me, if you break down what people are concerned about, those who have a negative view of Ukraine either being an EU member state or a NATO member, they cite various things. I mean, there is the basic fatigue with expansionism, which Natalie began with, and that's true, and that's not really directed at Ukraine in particular. It's a more general fatigue. But then when it comes to views of Ukraine in particular, there clearly is a concern about governance and corruption, sort of dirty politics, and there is also a concern about a nation which is at war, which has a conflict with the huge neighbor Russia. So, in essence, for Europe, the question is, why would you want to invite your neighbor round who has lots of problems attached to him? You don't necessarily want that neighbor in your house.
First of all, I am very optimistic about these numbers. We have only 2% to achieve the majority, so it's almost done. Second, I remember one British political scientist, Timothy Garton-Ash, published an essay saying that in year 2026 Ukraine will join European Union. So we still have 9 years to improve the situation. But I completely agree that we have a negative brand of Ukraine called corruption. And at the same time, I'm very optimistic because Ukraine has very strong demand from society to have leadership and to have people on the top who have zero tolerance on corruption. And in this sense, I believe today, tomorrow, in 1-2 years, but Ukrainian reforms will gonna be irreversible and completely positive stories, which makes Ukraine European country, and I believe in future will make Ukraine part of European Union, is our potential. Our potential is brilliant. Ukraine has strong IT people who are very like rising stars in Silicon Valley. Ukraine has IT potential and agricultural potential and transit potential, and Ukraine has well-educated people working for our economy during last years, making our country better. And at the same time, Ukraine has brilliant creative economy, creative industries, which comparing to European one, I think on a very cool level. A few weeks ago in this arsenal, in this audience was Ukrainian Fashion Week. Believe me, if you came here, you will believe in Ukrainian future, because our fashion or our graffitis or our modern art or our people making creative economies, they will be a strong voice in Europe in decade, maybe even sooner. So in this sense, I believe Ukraine gonna be part of European Union. So regarding the question about neighbor countries, I think the problem is that Ukraine spent so much time balancing between West and Russia. Ukraine wasted its time, and unfortunately Ukraine lost dynamic. But European Union looking forward for new blood. Maybe not now, maybe in 5-10 years, but European Union will ask Ukraine to join us, to join European Union, but at that time Ukraine has to be ready in economic sense, in sense of poverty, in sense of anti-corruption. And the changes of generation in Ukrainian politics make it happen. I believe it.
All right, good. Well, I'm supremely optimistic, and I'm going to open it up to questions in a minute, and I suspect some European members of our audience might want to pitch in on this. But before I get to that, I do want to pick, if I may, on an individual in the audience, Stephane Fouks. Stephane, are you? There you are. Stephane is, for those who don't know Stephane, he's the vice president of the Havas group. And the Havas group actually put together this survey for us here at Yes. So, Stephane, I want you just to give us a bit more detail, drill down into it, and give us your sense of what it really means and tells us.
The question is how to be optimist rather than realistic. Because what I hear, it's also a lot of dream, and I'm not sure that sometimes dreams are not a little bit too naive. What we see today, concretely, is that the number, the strength of the support from European population to the adhesion, immediate adhesion of Ukraine to Europe, has diminished by 1/3 in 10 years. So we are not at 48, close to 50. We come from 60 and we are at 48.
It's the direction of travel,
so
isn't it?
The direction, because when you are looking polls, you are always to look the direction. And the direction, we have to be honest, unfortunately, because it's not a happy news for me, is negative. It's negative first, as you all said, because there is in Europe a European fatigue. That's true. But also because it's clear that there is 3 reasons which are identified in the polls to have a fear about immediate adhesion of Ukraine in Europe. The first one is the cost of this adhesion. The second one is the system and the corruption, and the third one is the war and the situation with Russia. And all those 3 reasons together froze, I don't like this word because it's looking like the frozen war with Russia, but freeze the relation and the possibility to open in a short delay a real negotiation to enter in the EU.
Stephane, is one of those factors dominant over the others? If you had to pick out one which is the biggest obstacle right now, which would it be?
Oh, the first one I would say to comment what Tony Blair said is that we have a little problem in Europe today that the leaders don't lead, which means that they follow the opinion. And when you have a public opinion like that, it will be very difficult to find leaders who will want to fight against his public opinion to convince. I think that the first factor, the most important in the European fatigue, is that they don't want to pay anymore for the others. They don't want to pay, I would say, with the tax and in the public cost, because there is a new strength of egoism, which was also one of the reasons of the Brexit. So, still, we don't have a new perspective about Europe. Until we will not imagine a new Europe which will create new desire, we have to be honest with ourselves that we don't see today the leader in Europe which will fight against his public opinion to go in this direction right now. I think that it's also one more reason for Ukrainians to do the reform, because there is also a part of the polls which could be analyzed as very positive. If we compare with other countries, by large, Ukraine is the number one that Europeans consider as to be possibly part of Europe in a delay of 10 to 15 years. If we speak about value, if we speak about history and integration, there is no comparison. In the polls, there was also Russia, Morocco, and Turkey. And there is only one country which I will say is not far to fit a European majority and who can organize, I will say something like that, which is Ukraine. But we also see that the support is strong in Poland and Lithuania, I mean in the eastern part of Europe.
Yeah.
And is really poor. I mean, more you go west, more the support is poor. And at the end, the Netherlands, the French, and the Brits are those who support the least today. And in France, it's terrible. Huh? We have moved from 57% of support for the adhesion to 37%.
Right. Well, Stephane, that's a brilliant sort of analysis of the findings you had. I'm going to come back to the panel, and thank you so much for that. Yeah, thank you. Okay, panel, what are you going to do about it? Particularly, I mean, France is a great example. You have, you know, in terms of the core support for Ukraine being integrated into the European family, you have hemorrhage support in France. So what are you going to do about it?
So I'll just say two things quickly. I mean, one, I don't think it's helpful to look at this survey on a general basis. I think you literally have to look country by country. Looking at France is very different than looking at Poland in terms of the survey.
No question.
And I think you have to look question by question. So if you look at why people voted, they didn't believe Ukraine should join Europe. 31% say because they're against expansion, period. So if we just look at the general numbers. 31% say because it's a poor country. So if I were going to look at 31%, that's equivalent to the number that have fatigue. So the number one thing that they say, if it's specific to Ukraine, is that you're a poor country. Similarly, those who are in favor, only 27%, less than a third, think that it would help the European economy. So our biggest goal has to be to attack the specific issues that are specific to those countries. In France, it may be the appearance of corruption. Somewhere else, it has to do with them believing that we're an economic drag. And the reforms that are ongoing, the reforms that need to be sped up, the reforms that have not yet happened, that are on the list to happen, are the most important part of convincing these countries that we are not a poor country. We will not be a poor country. And when we're prepared to join and when they're prepared to accept our joining, we will be a plus to their economies, not a negative. I think that's got to be the one thing that we can do, and because it's not for them, it's for us.
Ivanna, you looked as though you wanted to say something. Aleksander. Yep.
Well, I would like to be, because I try to be optimistic, but now I would like to be a little bit realistic, and I think to change the situation in the coming years will be extremely difficult. Because, first of all, because of Europe and European problems. I think that, especially after German election and after Juncker's statement last days, we open a new period of European integration history, and we'll try to define or redefine the future of the EU.
And Juncker, if I'm sorry to interrupt, but Juncker clearly has an intent to integrate on a deeper level.
Yeah.
And if that is going to suck up the energy of the EU over the next few years, it's going to be very hard to combine that with thinking about major new expansion.
Of course, yes, and I think the problem will be even more complicated because I see the future of Europe as a Europe of not two speeds. It will be Europe of many speeds. The first speed, France, Germany. The second, Eurozone. Third, the countries which want to join Eurozone soon. Fourth speed, Schengen. Fifth speed, the countries not prepared to accept migrants, etc. Speed number 6, UK after Brexit. Speed number 7, Ukraine before membership, etc., etc. And I think we should be prepared that next years will be extremely difficult time to discuss about enlargement. I'm very much in favor of open door policy, Eastern neighborhood policy, etc., etc. But it's necessary to be realistic now, and it means that Ukraine should be extremely active, showing the arguments, and then about arguments. I think all these reforms, anti-corruption fight, etc., this is absolutely extremely important, and I'm glad what Prime Minister said and President yesterday. They did a lot. That's okay. And but what is my fear, that still the quality of political life in Ukraine is not enough good to encourage Europeans to think about Ukraine in a better way. Because today, Stephen, you mentioned, the main message, the main information from Ukraine is not about our conference, unfortunately, or not about Ukrainian reforms, but about Saakashvili on white horse, who is coming next week to Kiev. And I think as long as we will have such a very unstable, very unpredictable, and frankly speaking, with not enough high-quality political life here in Ukraine, I'm very much afraid that the media will create such not positive, but such strange picture of Ukraine. And that is something what you have to do, you politicians in Ukraine, because I think you can offer better communication with public opinion here in Ukraine and better communication with the West or with the European Union too.
I just have one more question, and I want to open it up just before we break for lunch. It just surprises me a great deal, and please take this, Minister or Vice Prime Minister, surprises me a great deal that the survey suggests there's a sort of more sympathetic attitude generally across the 10 European survey nations to the idea of Ukraine's NATO membership than Ukraine's EU membership. I mean, that seems odd to me, given that you have a conflict on your territory. NATO is a collective security organization, and obviously anybody thinking of offering Ukraine membership of NATO right now would therefore be inviting a conflict into the NATO space, which would, according to the collective security principle, mean that NATO might well be at war with Russia. So what's going on? I mean, how important is the NATO element of this? And isn't the truth that Russia will always have a de facto veto on Ukraine's membership of NATO simply because it can do what we've seen it do on the eastern border?
If I may, before answering you the question on NATO, just wanted to underline several important things. Ukraine is not asking for EU membership today. Ukraine understands that there is an association agreement that is a really very serious and very ambitious and very wide roadmap for reforms and changes in the country, and it's tough. So we need a leaning shoulder to go together through these reforms from the EU, because most of the nations who have gone through such experience of changes that we are going under the association agreement had much more support from the EU, basically. That's one thing. Another thing is that Ukraine today sees that European nations, or rather some member states, are trying to shy away from something that has been ratified by all the parliaments of the EU member states, and that is just acknowledgement of the European perspective and European choice of Ukraine. So, and this is something that we cannot accept, because it's up to Article 49 of the European Treaty, and it's up to Ukrainian people to decide when to submit the membership proposal. And then it's up to the EU countries to decide. That's another thing. One of the things that nobody has mentioned with regard to what President Juncker was saying about, he actually spoke about enlargement, but he also referred to necessity of membership guarantees for Western Balkans. And the EU is basically, with this policy, is dragging in the countries that not necessarily have the consensus inside of the countries, whether they want to join the EU or not, but they are denying even the membership, even the European perspective, not the membership perspective of Ukraine. So we just have to think about this. And with regard to NATO, I think the important thing is that European citizens have seen the capability and resilience of the Ukrainian people, ability to rebuild from the scratch the Ukrainian armed forces with the support from the outside. And that means that Ukraine is projecting a strength, and that Ukraine is already a donor, a contributor to the security of the EU, of each of the nations of the EU, because we are the ones who are holding the frontier of the democratic world in our eastern border. And Eisenhower has said that Eisenhower has said at one point that only strength can cooperate and weaknesses can only beg. Exactly, in defending ourselves, we are not begging. We are actually helping all the others to regroup, to reunite, and to be ready to also deter the threat that is coming from Russian Federation.
All right. I want to, in brief, have comments also from you, Minister, and then from Sergii, and then I want to quickly get a couple of questions in before we have to break. So be brief if you can.
Sure. My take on this differences, NATO versus EU session, is I believe, I don't know who were the participants of the poll, but if it's just regular citizens, right, I would say for them, the problems of economic turmoil, refugee, for them it's unemployment. For them, it's like more closer, personally, right, for Europeans than overall like NATO and war somewhere. I think that's explained why. It's just closer to the people's kind of perception. But we cannot change one. Just to conclude on my side, we cannot change Europe. We can only focus on ourselves, and that should be our agenda for foreseeable future. And again, especially, we cannot go country after country. That's not how it's done. On agenda implemented fully. And here in this room, we should have more positive messages. I'm not trying to say that we should be silent, but when we still talk about corruption in this room, right, that's where the problem comes. When we still talk about that some reforms
wouldn't it be more of a problem if we weren't talking
Sorry?
about... Wouldn't it be more of a problem if we weren't talking about corruption?
Understand me correctly. I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't talk about this. It should be less of the problem. And then Europe will have a more positive position on us, right?
No,
I missed yesterday's session on reformers, unfortunately. I had to go to the Cabinet of Ministers. But I've spoke with people afterwards, and there were a lot of mixed messages. There should be less of those, not because we shouldn't talk about this, but because Ukraine should be different.
Sergii.
Both integration to Europe and to NATO, it's about homework. It's not about moods in European Union, because Ukraine has to be prepared by itself. But at the same time, if we discuss about integration to NATO, it's not just about security measures. Of course, Ukraine has to improve military forces and these issues, but at the same time, to reform Secret Service of Ukraine. One of the crucial for integration to NATO is to stop the practice when Secret Service is interfering in private business relations, or came with the search or with the investigation to private companies to stop their activity, to block their accounts and to take control over their assets. It's a reality in Ukraine, but it has to be stopped, of course, in the path of NATO integration. Regarding integration to European Union, of course, anti-corruption is the same important as for NATO integration. Just recall last year's session. You were the moderator, the same panel a year ago. If you remember, there was interference to this panel from head of tax administration, Mr. Nasirov. Where is Mr. Nasirov now?
I remember.
He is resigned, he is under investigation, and I hope he's gonna be sentenced if we create anti-corruption court, of course.
Yeah.
It's okay, he's not working anymore, but it's just the sign of some kind of progress making reform. Of course, we have to go faster. We don't have time to waste on this path toward European or Euro-Atlantic institutions, but for make this possible, we have to collect one very important thing, strong political will of our leadership.
Right.
And unfortunately, with the strong pressure from society and with a strong support from abroad, from European Union, IMF or US government, it's quite difficult to collect this political will of our leadership. But I believe we could do this. And Ukraine, of course, would be part of our European institutions. Just to remind, 2003, European Mr. Verheugen, who was a commissioner on enlargement, he said Ukraine would never be part of association agreement. I just today found this statement. Today Ukraine is a part of association agreement. Mr. Prodi, President Kuchma, remember this president of European Commission, he said Ukraine has the same chance to be part of EU as New Zealand has this chance. But I believe it's not the true. Ukraine will be part of European Union, and I believe our generation will be witness of this process.
Well, you're right to point out, you're definitely right to point out that things can change. And as a Brit, I really do know things can change. So I take that point very well, but I think you also have it's important to remember what Stephane said about the direction of travel right now. So let us open it up to the audience, both Ukrainians and Europeans, well, frankly, anybody who wants to engage in this discussion of how Europe sees Ukraine today and how you convert those who are skeptical today into people who are offering real support tomorrow. So hands up and let's get on with it. We'll start here.
Thank you, Stephen. Thomas Molaritas from APCO. You've talked about economics, you've talked about politics, a bit about security, but you didn't mention at all people to people. There's a visa-free regime now that is changing a lot. And do you know what is the largest European diaspora living in Europe? It's actually Ukrainians. It's estimated that 20 million Ukrainians are living abroad. And it's much larger than Poland. So the question is, Ivanka disagrees, maybe it's the wrong figure, but the question is, what is being done to increase the people-to-people exchange, because this will be another driving force for Ukraine's integration to Europe.
Okay, good thought. Let's get a couple more before we actually get to the panel. Yes, ma'am?
Yes, thank you. Marie Mandras from Sciences Po in Paris. I very much agree with your responses, which I think are very sober about that. Much has to do with Ukraine and where Ukraine is going. But what I observe in our countries, and in particular my country, France, is that most people are not well informed about Ukraine. So I'm asking all of you, and especially Madam Vice Prime Minister and Mr. Minister, what do you intend to do to improve information about your own country in our countries? I think it is absolutely key. Thank you.
Okay, well, those two are sort of related, so let's just pause and deal with those two. But be brief, panel. Pitch in whoever wants to. First of all, Thomas's point about people-to-people ties, how important they are and how Ukraine can make best use of them. Thoughts, please.
Well, nothing could be done artificially, right? I think the best example of people ties, and this is a road to success, is business. Business. When I commute from London to Ukraine, used to be full. The plane was full with businessmen. They believed in the country, and now I see that there is more and more trust in the country, and so that's what we're doing. We improve business climate. Visa-free definitely have helped to do it both directions, right? And when businesses are happy here, making money here, this is their best ambassadors around their countries. Obviously, also this year we launch a program on exchange of students, put more money to finance it, so that we'll have more Ukrainians travel to EU, young Ukrainians, to also share the experience, tell about Ukraine story, and that also contributes to the people-to-people exchanges.
All right, and Ivanna, I want to move on so we can get more questions in. So Ivanna addressed the second point about
The information.
Yeah,
The
I mean, in a way,
the lack of information.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this question, because what we are seeing, that bad news are immediately making that their way to the front pages of all the newspapers. We're all over the newspapers if something bad is happening in Ukraine. However, with our boring news of, for example, saving 10% of whatever was budgeted for the public procurement because of Prozoro electronic system, we are not getting through with this message because it's boring, it's not sexy, it's not something that would support the argument that Ukraine is corrupt. And so there we need not only our voices, we need your translation of what we have to say and packaging it in the way that your public would understand and accept. Because maybe we're coming, from our own perception of the world, and we do want to say, okay, we're working really hard in order to make things happen and change. But it doesn't mean that we are succeeding with the speed that we would be satisfied with. And therefore, I am reaching out to everybody who can have a word out on Ukraine and what exactly you're saying by painting an objective picture of Ukraine, not a white, not an ideal picture. Moreover, one of the wise and gray-haired European politicians once told me that if you would take a picture of Ukraine today, you probably wouldn't be satisfied. It wouldn't be the ideal picture. But if you would make a movie of 3 years, the 3 last years about Ukraine, you would really see that Ukraine is moving in the direction that Ukrainian people have chosen, and Ukraine is moving in that direction that it has announced for. So we will work more. I hope you will add to our work as well. But also do not forget, we have a tiny thing that is hindering that effort as well. That's the Russian propaganda. And I'm surprised that we haven't mentioned that yet.
With all due respect to my colleagues, it just means that we have to invest our resources in our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in our Ministry of Economy to enable trade representatives in these countries. We need to do more from our side as well. So, I mean, I get it that much of this is business, but we have a role to play in each one of these embassies. I would argue Italy and France, when you look at the numbers here, require an enormous amount of extra effort on the part of our diplomatic and our trade representatives to the extent that we have them or we're expanding them. I know it's an ongoing debate.
All right,
but I think there's a role that we play.
Sergii, yeah.
Also, I believe Ukraine going to be the same phenomena as Romania now is. Romania is well known all over the world, the country fighting against corruption on non-stop basis. So they continue investigations, they start investigation, they imprison officials, not only former but current one, and it will make Ukraine famous in few years. And regarding people-to-people exchange, I see there is our friends from Germany, Marie-Louise Beck, and of course she was the witness of the process when Berlin became a star on the map of Europe. And Ukraine is the same. Berlin was, at that time in the 90s, it was the slogan, Berlin is poor but sexy. Ukraine is the same. Ukraine is poor, it's true, but Ukraine is sexy. It's a vibrant country with new generation of people who are ready to take responsibility for the country, with completely new modern art, modern culture, modern music, modern contemporary art. So this is the country to be. And this is a destination to be in boring Europe. Believe me, if you compare some countries in Europe, Ukraine made huge step forward. I know this because I'm traveling a lot and I have knowledge to compare. Yeah. In this sense, what we have to do, we have to make Ukraine famous in Europe as a destination to be, and to demonstrate our European friends that we are the same, we share the same values, we are the same educated, and we can speak on the same language. In this sense, I believe Ukraine is a brilliant destination.
I see a future for you, Sergii, in brand management and public relations. The Ukraine slogan around the world is going to be what? Relatively poor, but very sexy.
It's not bad. It's not bad.
And you're going to work on the poor bit, obviously. The sexy bit you can live with for a while.
But sexy in positive sense, not in the gender sense, but in sense
no, I know. All right, last one or two, because we're going to be late for lunch. Because I haven't been over there, you, sir, over that side, and then, yep, you there, and then we're going to have to stop. Make them short, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. With current waves of populism and nationalism in Europe, slow rate of reforms, and continuation of instability on the east of Ukraine, How do you foresee the results of these polls in 2, 5, or 10 years? Will the approval rate of Ukraine continue to fall or once again begin to rise? Thank you.
Okay, I just want one person to take that on. Yep, you, Minister, you go for it. Why not? You look like you're ready to.
Well, I know. Maybe I will. It's very similar to how we started. Actually, it all depends how Europe will develop, right? So again, we started that this is actually more about Europe, how European sentiment, than about Ukraine. What we can do from this, in any way, regardless. I don't know what will happen with Europe. I hope it will get stronger. But regardless, Ukraine needs to get stronger. So I don't know how the polls will change. But I want Ukraine to be different in 10 years. I want Ukraine to be richer. I want Ukraine to have high social standards. I hope Ukrainians to enjoy high quality healthcare, education. That's what we're doing.
All right, I guess the message is we take care of our business and the rest of it will take care of itself. I think that seems to make sense to me. But let's have a last question and then we're going to have lunch.
Thank you very much. A very short remark. Dear Sergei, when I say that I'm going to Kiev in Germany, people tell me, well, you are really a brave person. Because they think it's still war in this country. And they don't have an idea that the war is far in the east and that you have a normal life here. This is number one. Number two is there is a white elephant in this room. And this is in Germany, and I know in France, when I meet my French colleagues, this feeling, well, we know we made a mistake because we really provoked Russia inviting Ukraine into the EU. In a meeting of two foreign committees, German and French, the French colleagues, and they were from the Hollande fraction, they said, we shouldn't have started that whole business with the EU association in the first case. And in Germany, you know how strong the Russian propaganda is. You come, you speak out openly, which is necessary in a democracy, about all the faults there are, and there are a lot of problems. And it is just soaked up because there is so many people in Germany that just would love to go back to good old terms with Moscow. And we have the feeling you guys from Ukraine are disturbing that. And this is what you are also fighting, and this is why we need so much international good signs, like you said.
Okay, well, it's a very interesting and useful observation, not so much a question. Anybody want to just very quickly respond to that sense of how difficult the job is in certain countries, and we've zeroed in on France and Germany at the moment, but this is going to be tough and it's going to take a while. Natalie?
I think in the end, our results will enable everyone to get over that. Right now, people are thinking of the past. Did they make a mistake or not? It's our job to prove that it was no mistake. In fact, our perspective, if you want to call it perspective, our membership, if that's what it becomes, is a plus for Europe. And we will prove that as we do these reforms and as this country proves its value to itself, its own citizens, and the people who think of the past and the decisions that they made, whether they were right or wrong, it will all be part of history. It has to be, it has to be us that changes our country, and then, through that, the results will change the minds of those who fear they made a mistake. Clearly, we all think that they did not make a mistake.
All right. Well, I think that's a good thought to end on. I thank all of my panel. I thank you for a wonderful morning, and I now recommend we all head for lunch and see you back here this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, panel.